webinar series for Students for Liberty. We're thrilled today to have Dr. Jim Lark doing his presentation on how governmentally mandated safety measures may be hazardous to your health. Thank you all again for coming. I know that these have been increasingly popular, but I'm going to do a quick blurb about SFL right now and our major event coming up in just less than 3 short weeks. I think we're down to 19 days. Now, Students for Liberty is a 501c3 nonprofit that works with students and is run completely by students and for students to provide resources and connections on college campuses to advance liberty. Some of our resources include free books, our e-leadership webinar series, which you're listening to now, tabling kits, and of course, our conferences. Our 4th annual International Students for Liberty Conference is coming up in 19 days, and we actually are almost at capacity for fire code, so if you have not registered and plan on coming, I would highly suggest it. It's here in Washington, D.C. The price is great. We're going to have hundreds and hundreds of students from over 25 different countries here just to network and discuss and debate and really just find the best practices for spreading liberty where they come from. Now, of course, Dr. Jim Lark is one of our most prominent speakers. He's been here 4 times, I believe, now. He's a professor at University of Virginia in the Engineering and Applied Science Department and serves as the advisor to the Liberty Coalition at the University of Virginia. He is the former national chairman of the Libertarian Party and also is the recipient of the Samuel Adams Award from the Libertarian Party, which he received in 2004, and the Thomas Jefferson Award, which is the party's highest honor, given for lifetime achievement in 2008. He is a member of the Board of Directors of the International Society for Individual Liberty and the Board of Directors for the Advocates of Self-Government. And he is also on the Board of Advisors for us at Students for Liberty. Thank you again, Dr. Lark, for coming and sharing your wisdom with the students, and I'm going to hand it right over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Peter, for this. Certainly appreciate your kindness. Hopefully everyone can now see my screen. And so what I would like to do is to give you a talk on what I think is a particularly interesting topic. It's one that fits in well with my work. It's entitled Warning, Governmentally Mandated Safety Measures May Be Hazardous to Your Health. And this talk actually emerges from some lectures that I've given at the University of Virginia. This talk is based on some material that I provide to students who are interested in risk and return. The outline of the presentation this evening, I'll give you a brief little bit of information about me. I'll offer some general comments about improving the ability of liberty activists to promote the ideas of liberty. Then I'll get into the meat of the discussion, which are some examples of governmental efforts to reduce risk and to point out that there is a potential for perverse consequences, and then I'll entertain questions and comments. I'm the utility infielder in the School of Engineering and Applied Science at the University of Virginia. I hang my shingle principally in systems and information engineering, but I also teach in applied mathematics and statistics. I've also served as a lecturer in the McIntire School of Commerce at the University of Virginia. Previously, in a previous lifetime, I served as a visiting scholar at the Center for Study of Public Choice when it was still at Virginia Tech. I also had the honor of serving as an Earhart Foundation visiting fellow at the Center for Research in Government Policy and Business at the University of Rochester. As Peter mentioned, I have the honor of serving as advisor of the Liberty Coalition and its constituent organizations at the University of Virginia. I'm on the Board of Advisors for Students for Liberty. I chair the newly formed Student Libertarian Alumni Committee. I also chair the Board of Directors for the Advocates for Self-Government, and I'm serving as the Secretary for the Board of Directors for International Society for Individual Liberty, ISIL. I've been involved in the Libertarian Party in various ways. He was kind enough to mention a couple of the awards that I won. I guess they ran out of good people, so they gave me a couple of awards. I always like to offer a couple of general comments about these webinars and about my talks in particular. There are a couple of major aspects in terms of improving the ability of liberty activists to, quote, sell the product, unquote. You might imagine we can improve the message, we can improve the messenger, and we need to do both. 2 extremely important points. I hope you will consider these remarkably obvious, but I'll mention them anyway. We must observe the highest standards of intellectual integrity. One thing that has bothered me greatly is that just as Democrats, Republicans, Socialists, Greens, what have you, will engage in all manner of violations of what I consider to be good, scrupulous, intellectual inquiry. Unfortunately, people of liberty-oriented disposition can do the same thing. If we seek to be advocates for a libertarian society, if we seek to be advocates of liberty, we must uphold the highest standards of intellectual integrity. Also, we must treat people with courtesy and respect. Again, I hope these 2 points strike you as remarkably obvious. You may be saying, why is he boring us with this? I actually hope that that will be the case, because I hope you already understand the importance of these 2 points. The purpose of this webinar, and I should note that the webinar has an intentionally provocative title. The title is perhaps more provocative than the actual lecture will be. What I want to do is to help the attendees of this webinar analyze issues of risk and regulation. I also want to indicate, I don't know that this will come as any great surprise, but I want to indicate that government regulation to promote safety may result in more harm rather than less. Now, let me emphasize that when I look at government regulation on behalf of promotion of safety, it is not that the regulators are stupid people or evil people. Quite the contrary. In many cases, they're well-meaning people, and they're very nice, decent people, and they're very bright. But unfortunately, in our world, we live in a world where people sometimes don't respond in the ways that the regulators will think. And so it is difficult to anticipate how people will respond to regulation, and therefore there's always that unintended consequences animal that will bite you in the nether extremity. Isolating one aspect of a complicated set of interactions for the purpose of optimization can be extremely dangerous. Unfortunately, a lot of analysis undertaken by government to prevent or reduce risk frequently involves isolating aspects of very complicated set of interactions. And unfortunately, if you engage in optimizing with respect to that isolated aspect, you may cause overall system degradation. That's the fancy way of saying you may do something and cause everything to turn to poop. Poop is not actually the 4-letter word I usually use. There's a maxim that people like to employ, better safe than sorry. Well, frankly, I think that's a darn good idea. Unfortunately, there are many situations where we don't know what safe is and we don't know what sorry is. One interesting point about this concerns issues, say, of dealing with anthropogenerated global warming. To the extent it exists, it's not clear what safe is and what sorry is. So always keep in mind when you hear people say, well, better safe than sorry, in cases where you actually know what safe and sorry are, seems like a pretty good principle to me. Unfortunately, in many cases, it's not that easy to figure out which is which. The last little point that I have here isn't no risk is the highest risk of all. This is a phrase attributed to the late Aaron Wildavsky, who analyzed matters of risk and regulation. And I think he summed up very nicely the point that in our effort to pursue zero risk, we may be actually increasing risk, that to live in an environment of zero risk, to the extent it's actually possible, it may be a situation where we're trying to reduce risk. All we end up doing is redistributing it in some fashion. We're even increasing that risk. So let me take an example. And this is one I always like to toss out with my students at the University of Virginia. I love to drive automobiles, and I like to drive them fast. Let's stipulate that for any given speed X, 55 miles an hour, 80 miles an hour, what have you, let's stipulate that all things being equal, you're safer if you're wearing your seat belt, safety harness, whatever you want to call it, than if you're not. So in other words, I think we will, for the purpose of this discussion, we'll stipulate that at any given speed, if all things are taken as equal, you're safer wearing your seat belt than if you're not, if you're involved in an accident. Okay. Now, there are peculiar situations, for example, pregnant women wearing lap belts in the back seat of a car, where perhaps this doesn't true. But for the purpose of our discussion, let's agree that at any given speed, if you're involved in an accident, you're going to be safer than if you're not. Okay? Now, let's ask the question. Given this stipulation, would we have fewer traffic fatalities if the government requires that everyone wear a seatbelt? Perhaps it does it by virtue of mandating seatbelt wearing as a, say, primary enforcement offense. Maybe it forces the manufacturers of automobiles in Detroit or Tokyo or Stuttgart to arrange their car so that you can't get the car into first gear unless you're wearing your belt. So let's ask that question. Now, Jim Lark's answer, Jim's a bit slow and stupid. Jim Lark's answer is, I don't know. Let's think about this question at greater length. In my experience, and I suspect that for many of you in the audience, you probably will have the same experience, drivers who are wearing their seat belts feel safer and more secure behind the wheel of a car than those who are not. Also in my experience, as drivers feel safer and more secure, the drivers increase the aggressiveness of their driving. And again, on the margin, drivers who feel safer are willing to take more risks. Now, I can speak from personal experience. Again, I like to drive, and I like to drive a wee bit faster than the posted speed limit. I'm in the fortunate position as a university professor, a relatively well-paid university professor. I can afford fairly high-performance automobiles, and I noticed that when I started driving high-performance automobiles, that on the margin, my driving became more aggressive. Now, it's not like I started running down little old ladies in crosswalks, but I noticed that because the car would perform, I would push it a little bit further to the envelope. If I'm following that really slow truck and I see that little bit of space that will allow me to get by the truck, I'm more inclined, because of the high-performance automobile, because I feel safer and more secure in the high-performance automobile, I could tell the aggressiveness of my driving increased. So if it is true that drivers who feel safer are more aggressive, then it's possible that there will be an increase in the severity of consequences when accidents actually occur. In other words, people who feel safer and more secure, if they increase the degree of riskiness of their actions, perhaps now when accidents occur, they occur under more dangerous circumstances, higher speed, perhaps the angle of the accident because people are whipping around slower vehicles. It's possible we will see more severe accidents and therefore more fatalities. So again, and I admit we're concatenating a lot of ifs here, but if the effect that I'm suggesting is real, and if we aggregate that effect over millions of drivers and billions of miles driven, we may find that the net effect of requiring more seatbelt usage may be more fatalities, not fewer. Now, I'm not arguing that. I don't have the data to say this is what happened. By the way, let me note, I think it's a darn good idea to wear your seatbelt. In fact, if I didn't look like such a dork, I would get a 5-point racing harness, I'd get a crash helmet, because I like to be safe behind the wheel of a car. But we have to consider the possibility that there may be unintended consequences, that people who are belted now feel a little bit more secure, they may drive a little bit more aggressively, and therefore they may cause more problems. There are also some data to suggest that in places where they had primary enforcement of seatbelt regulation laws, in other words, the cop could pull you over and ticket you for failing to wear your belt, there were some suggestions that you may have had car passenger or driver fatalities going down, but you may have had some increase in terms of pedestrian fatalities. Now, of course, that may also have something to do with right on red laws. It's kind of hard to disaggregate the consequences. The main point, however, is to keep in mind, as I said previously, if you are isolating one aspect of a complicated set of interactions, you may be able to optimize that aspect, but you may cause problems elsewhere. I'd like to put forth this thought experiment. Would automobile safety be increased if instead of mandating an airbag in the steering wheel of the column, the driver's steering wheel column, we mandated a sharp steel spike that is pointed at the heart of the driver, and the faster you go, the closer the spike gets to your heart? Now, the point of this, no possible pun intended, is that when we drive cars, there's a very complicated set of risk evaluations taking place in terms of our behavior. And by the way, this example, I should give credit to Gordon Tullock, the economist, although he may have gotten this from Sam Peltzman, the economist at the University of Chicago. I think this is a very good question that illustrates very well that we have this complicated set of interactions, and we have to be very careful when we start mandating that people behave a certain way, or we start mandating certain technology. It's possible that we may bring about benefits. I actually think that having more drivers belted, having more safety technology, typically is a good thing. However, we just have to be a little careful in terms of the actual consequences, and we have to care about those consequences. We actually have to try to ascertain what consequences really obtain. It should be noted as well, as some of you are, I think, old enough, I suspect are old enough to know this, that airbag deployment has killed small children. My acquaintance, I have an acquaintance who is a gentleman named Tim Slagle, who is a comedian, and Mr. Slagle used to point out that when you would see stock footage of airbag deployment, it was usually run at slow motion, and he noted that this airbag coming out, it looks like this nice, soft, comfy pillow into which you can nestle your face very nicely, when in reality it's more like a shotgun blast coming at you. And it as was noted in various forums, airbag deployment has actually killed small children who were not properly set in their seats. Now, is this an argument against airbags? Not necessarily. It's possible that airbags, in terms of their aggregate benefit, may actually save more lives. In fact, I think they do. But I think we have to be very careful about simply assuming, in a rather naive fashion, that certain safety technologies are clearly beneficial. It may be true, but we actually have to check the data. We actually have to look. And we also have to consider the possibility that there may be people who are actually hurt, perhaps killed, by virtue of safety devices or regulations that may actually be on net benefit. Of course, the question is who gets to net these benefits, under what rules and criteria are used when you net benefits, when you're comparing benefits to losses in this situation. By the way, I mentioned that with the so-called click it or ticket laws, the primary enforcement laws regarding safety belts, some people have noted that highway fatalities have decreased. I think that's correct. So let's ask the question, assuming that that comment is true, in other words, assuming that the click it or ticket laws have coincided with decrease in highway fatalities, should one infer that such laws have reduced those highway fatalities? Lark's answer, as typical, I don't know. Let's think about the question at greater length. There are many possible things that might impact, no pun intended, whether traffic fatalities are heading downward. For example, what are the long-term trends in traffic fatalities? A lot of discussion about governmental mandates of safety technology with respect to automobiles has focused on the fact that we've seen trends downward in traffic fatalities, but these trends have been going down for a very long time. It's very unusual for us to have situations where you would have spikes. So it's possible that for a variety of reasons you might see traffic fatalities going down that have nothing to do with the particular technology that's involved. You also have to ask questions about were there any substantial changes in traffic volume. For example, traffic volume frequently decreases during recessions. So when you look at the time periods, you should look at macroeconomic variables to see what was going on. Were there any other changes in the laws? Maybe there are other changes that took place that perhaps it makes it difficult to determine whether or not the particular safety technology that's been mandated has actually had the beneficial effects claimed. Now, I suspect that I'm not telling you, by virtue of going through things like this, I'm not telling you anything truly profound. But again, when we try to understand how risk and regulation are related, it's important for us to get into the habit of asking the right questions. Let me take another example, and again, I like to use this example with my students. We have an aerospace engineering program at the University of Virginia, and let's assume that we're going to measure the safety of large jet airplanes by what I call positive scalar quantities, in other words, numbers. You could measure safety with respect to a variety of criteria, in which case your measurement might be in terms of something called a vector quantity. Let's assume that we're going to measure safety by numbers. And let's also assume that a bigger number is a better number. In other words, if I have two planes that have safety measures X and Y, and if little x is less than little y, we would conclude that Y is the safer plane. So we're going to measure safety by numbers, which is, by the way, not an easy thing to do. I'm not sure how you would actually do that appropriately, but let's say we're going to do that for the sake of discussion. And let's assume that a bigger number is a better number, a safer plane. All right. Let's say that because you're a brilliant aerospace engineering student at UVA, and of course all students at UVA are brilliant, as they are likely to tell you, you have invented a device that will increase the safety of such airplanes by a factor of 10. In other words, full order of magnitude improvement. And let's assume further your device can be retrofitted on planes that are already in service. The FAA decides, because of this wonderful new device, we're going to mandate that all airlines must use this device. In other words, all the planes that they purchase must now incorporate this device, and that all older planes that they have in their service fleet must be retrofitted with this device. So let's say we have this mandate. Question: if the airline firms are required to use this device, will there be fewer fatalities? Lark's answer: I think you know what's coming here. I don't know. Let's think about this question at greater length. First of all, we have to ask the question, by fewer fatalities, what are we talking about? Are we talking about air travel fatalities? Are we talking about all travel-related fatalities? These questions might have very different answers. So you have to be sure you clarify the question. This is one thing when people discuss risk and regulation. I find that a substantial amount of my time is involved trying to clarify what they're talking about, how they use the language, what do their terms mean. So in this question, we have to clarify what's the question. Given the assumptions of the problem, the way I've set up this problem, I consider it likely that mandating the use of this device would reduce air travel fatalities. However, unless we have more information, we're not going to be able to predict with any degree of accuracy the answer to the second question. In other words, are we talking about overall travel fatalities? And in particular, in order for us to answer this question, or at least to try to answer it, we're going to need to know the cost of the mandate. What actually happens in terms of response of mandating the incorporation of this safety technology? If the mandate were to raise substantially the cost of getting on an airplane and flying from here to there, it's likely the airlines are going to have to pass along that cost to those who fly. It very well may be that the people who run the airlines and their stockholders might decide that as a great big gift to the flying public, they'll eat the costs. My guess is that that's not terribly likely. Well, if the cost of flying increases significantly, we may see a substantial shift out of the flying mode to the driving mode. And I can speak from personal experience. I suspect you're in the same situation. There are times where, for certain trips, it will depend, my decision as to whether to drive to the location or to fly to the location may depend substantially upon the price of the airplane ticket. There are certain times where it's kind of nice to be able to drive from one place to another. I might be able to visit friends along the way. I would have my own car when I get to my destination. So there are many benefits to driving to the destination. There are many benefits to flying. If the cost of flying increases substantially, I may shift to driving, which I think is a demonstrably less safe mode of travel vis-a-vis large passenger airplanes. So it's possible that if you mandate the incorporation of this new technology, even if everybody agrees, there is absolutely no doubt whatsoever your device improves airline safety. Not a question in the world. It is possible that the total number of fatalities could increase even if you have improved substantially the quality of airplane safety. By the way, another point, let me actually, before I go to example 3, let me step back, if I may, concerning this business of this device. You've invented a device that will increase the safety of such airplanes by a factor of 10. Now this sounds really, really impressive. And indeed, it very well may be impressive. But there's another aspect of risk and regulation that you must ask, and that is, are you increasing the safety from, say, a factor of your probability of dying in an airline crash is 1 in a billion to 1 in 10 billion? And is that really a difference that makes a difference to you? It's possible that increasing safety, perhaps even by a very large factor, is essential. It basically has essentially no value to you, or at least very little value. So even in situations where incorporation of technology, development of a product may have markedly improved health characteristics or safety characteristics, it's still not clear that it's worth doing it, because it may be that the value of the increase is imperceptible to the person who will actually be the beneficiary of that increase in safety. Example 3, and this is in many ways the big example, because this is the one about which people have been writing, complaining, demonstrating in some cases for many years. The Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, regulates the safety and effectiveness of medicines, medical devices, etc. In fact, it regulates a lot of stuff. Let's start by asking a question which may seem a stupid question. What's a safe drug? Lark's answer, again, by now you probably figured this out, Lark's answer will be, I don't know. Let's think about this question at greater length. If one defines a safe drug as one that poses no risk to anyone when taken as directed, it's not by any means clear to me that any drug is safe. Water is fatal to you if you drink too much of it, and certainly it's fatal to you if you fall in too much of it. So you have to be very, very careful. When you start talking about a safe drug, what do you mean? Even if a safe drug existed under this definition, it's not clear that one could prove such a drug is safe. In other words, even if you find a safe drug, how do you prove it's safe? How would you actually go about proving it? Human body chemistry differs so widely that it would be very difficult to prove that you would have a safe drug under this definition of safety. It's also possible that the only safe substances, given this notion of safety, may be ones that will not be in any sense useful in combating the diseases against which this drug is supposed to be used. If we look at this analysis, if we think about this, then if the FDA is mandated that they must come up with safe and effective, this is the result of the Kefauver amendments going back to the 1960s, if the FDA must prove something is safe and effective, we're probably going to have to change the definition of safety to allow for some possibility that you will have life-saving or at least life-improving benefits while allowing for the possibility of causing harm. In other words, again, if we take the definition of a safe drug where nobody gets hurt if the drug is used properly, it's possible no such drug will exist. So in order for us to be able to live in the real world, we may have to adjust the definition of what's safety. All right, well, if we do that, then what, again, is a safe drug? And if we define a safe drug as one which perhaps has substantial perhaps life-saving benefits, but allows for the possibility of harm, how should the FDA trade off those benefits and harms? Leave aside the moral question about whether they have the right. Leave aside the legal question about exactly what they should be able to regulate. How should you trade off benefits and harms? You know, how would you actually do it? What measuring stick? Are you going to actually do a body count and say, if this many corpses stack up by virtue of the use of this, and this many people are saved, we will approve the drug? Is that how we're going to do it? All right. I could give a very long list of examples in terms of how we might, look at this issue. But I want to put at this point a couple of slides here because I think that this in many ways focuses on this issue. If you excuse me a moment, I just want to flip through for a couple of, okay. I wanted to provide this to you because I think this actually summarizes an important point about the nature of risk and regulation, particularly in this area. The comment here is from a woman named Edie Bacon. This comment was rendered in the November 29, 2002 issue of the Wall Street Journal. Ms. Bacon wrote an op-ed piece. The subject line of the op-ed piece is, "My life's not FDA approved." And the final 3 paragraphs of the article I think are worthy of your consideration because in many ways they really do encapsulate some of the interesting issues involved in terms of risk and regulation. And allow me to read this. I'm sure you can read it, but I like to do this for dramatic effect. The government wants proof of efficacy before it will allow me to take this drug outside of an approved trial. But the, quote, proof, unquote, is years away, and I need the drug now. It's safe. It might work. Johnson & Johnson would let me have it if they could do so without the threat of a government hassle. But they're so caught up in the FDA web that the life of an individual patient has no importance whatsoever. Without ET-743, I'm a dead woman walking. 5 kids are going to wonder why they're left without a mother. Won't somebody help me get this drug? I think this sums it up very nicely, because if the FDA, with the best of intentions, is trying to prevent unsafe substances from getting on the market, nobody wants to open up a container of Tylenol, pop a Tylenol, and find that you're in searing pain a few minutes later because the people manufacturing Tylenol haven't done it properly. They've given you something that's going to cause you grievous harm or great distress. However, there are invariably trade-offs involved in this. And in the particular case of Ms. Bacon, she wants to use a particular substance. The FDA basically has police powers to enforce its mandates and can prevent people from obtaining substances legally, even when they are informed consumers who are willing to take the risk. And so here is a clear-cut case of where government regulation, again, I'm willing to stipulate that it's enacted with the best of intentions, can cause tremendous problem, perhaps death. An interesting point about this, let's say that the FDA were to relinquish its so-called police powers over what a customer can ingest for his or her own safety, health, and comfort. It's possible that the costs of the regulatory process, just those costs, may be sufficiently great as to cause unnecessary suffering, injury, and death. For example, the costs of the regulatory process may include the additional expense that firms must go through in order to obtain approval. And by the way, again, in terms of the regulatory regime of the FDA, you have to prove not only safe, but effective. This is the point that Ms. Bacon was referring to. The drug, this particular drug that she was considering, it's called ET-743, it had already been demonstrated, at least to the satisfaction of the FDA, it was safe. But they also have to prove effectiveness or efficacy. And by virtue of doing this, the drug is kept off the market, perhaps beyond a time where Ms. Bacon could use it to save her life. Now, it's not at all clear the drug would have saved her life, but it strikes me that it's certainly her decision, or it should be her decision, as to whether or not to try it. And who knows, it might have worked very, very well. So again, this expense, it could be capitalized by virtue of the higher cost of medicine. Maybe it prices certain customers out of the market. They can't afford the medicine, or they can't afford as much medicine as they would like or as recommended. Also, the additional time needed to bring the medicine to market may basically lengthen substantially the delay in terms of ability of people to obtain these substances, and therefore the time cost, we may have to reckon that in terms of lots of lives lost to the regulatory delay. Now, I noted previously, this is an area where the issue of, quote, hazardous to your health has been substantially brooded about. There are many people who have taken up the cause of trying to ease the cost burden in terms of both expense of the medicine and the additional time cost because of the regulatory delay. There are a lot of people who are politically involved in this issue. So this is an issue that has received a lot of attention. Unfortunately, there are still far too many examples, at least from my perspective, where government regulation is causing real problems, and there is, in my opinion, a much better regime, which is basically informed consent, people making their own choices without the police power of the FDA. In other words, I believe the police power should be abolished. There are many additional potential hazards associated with mandated safety measures, particularly in the field of medication, that perhaps are a bit less obvious. I'm not sure what the age composition of those of you in the audience is, but for people in my generation, many years ago when we started to see the mandated use of so-called child-proof caps on prescription medicine, as well, not just prescription, but over-the-counter medication. There was some flap about the fact that in many cases, by virtue of child-proofing the bottles, of course you don't want little children stumbling in and inadvertently taking medicines that are not for them, but in the effort to improve safety with respect to the child market, if you will, you may have made it more difficult for people who are elderly, perhaps they're ill, perhaps they're frail. It may have made it more difficult for the elderly to open their containers so that they could take their medicine. Now, again, it's very hard to know what the impact of this is in terms of cost and benefit. The reason I mention this is that it's something that perhaps people didn't consider when they imposed the regulation that we must have child-proof cap. They may not have realized that they may have also been making them elderly-proof and therefore hurting people who may have been unseen to the regulators. The regulators may never have considered the fact that perhaps this might actually hurt elderly people. Another one, and this is something that perhaps you've noticed, perhaps with some irritation. If you watch television, and I watch a lot of sports on TV, perhaps there are many advertisements for various over-the-counter medications, one will frequently hear extensive warnings. In other words, you will see the TV commercial, you'll see happy smiling people who are now able to enjoy their lives because they've enjoyed the benefits of this nice new miracle drug, and then you will hear a voice reading over, usually at a much faster pace, about the potential side effects that might attend these various medicines. And you will hear, in fact, in some cases, the list of possible side effects might be longer than the commercial. Now, you have to ask the question, is it possible that people will be more scared off by listening to all these possible maladies that they could contract by virtue of adverse consequences? How many people may decide not to take a medication that would help them? And I brought this example up because this is a classic example of the sort of problem that people who are acting with the best of intentions may face. We certainly want people to be warned about potential side effects. If I'm going to take a certain type of medication, I'd like to know, is there something I should look out for? You know, to be forewarned is to be forearmed. But it's possible that I might be sufficiently scared off by the prospect of these various maladies. And incidentally, the TV commercials that have these warnings, there's usually no effort to portray what are the relative risks. It's not at all clear how likely you are, if you take this particular wonder drug, how likely you are to encounter adverse side effects. So you really don't have a way of knowing, am I better off, is it more likely that I will be benefited, or is it more likely I will be harmed by virtue of this medication? So again, one might reasonably ask, how many people are being deterred and what is the ultimate consequence? It's very hard to measure this, by the way. There are many more examples of situations in which regulation designed to promote safety may actually make life less safe. A quick list, for example, there have been flaps over the use of chlorine for the purpose of decontaminating drinking water. There are people who are worried that the possibility of too much chlorine use might eventually lead to increased cancer. Well, that may be, but of course, if you have unsafe drinking water, lots and lots of people may die. In fact, there was a big scandal in Peru many years ago because of the possibility that the Peruvians had been sort of, I shouldn't say strong-armed, but they'd been influenced by EPA notions that you need to reduce the level of chlorine in terms of trying to decontaminate water. There was a major outbreak of cholera. It's possible that by virtue of trying to reduce the risk of chlorine with respect to causing cancer, you may have increased the deaths due to cholera. There are all sorts of questions about issues, say, involving pesticides and fungicides. You know, you may want to reduce the amount of fungicide you put on agricultural crops because of the possibility of pesticide or fungicide contamination, residue, the possibility that people might get in slightly increased levels of cancer. Of course, if you get rid of certain effective fungicides, you might have a lot more people dying by virtue of aflatoxins say if they eat a lot of peanuts in Africa, if you reduce the ability of people to use certain types of substances that perhaps will kill the fungus that causes the aflatoxin, then maybe in the interest of regulating or promoting one type of safety, you may increase substantially other types of risk. So there are a fairly long list of these problems where regulation designed with the best of intentions to improve safety, it's possible it may actually make life less safe. Now you might ask, why am I not giving more examples in this case? It's because in many cases the work that I've seen that have tried to prove that we actually see substantial diminution in safety, I actually have some questions as to just how good that research is. Just as in the case of people who are saying these various regulations have promoted safety, I'm not sure whether they've done the appropriate scientific quality testing. So I haven't provided a list of citations here. I'd be happy, for those of you who are really interested in this, I can point you in some interesting directions. Let me return to a previous slide to emphasize 4 major points in terms of analysis. Whenever someone comes to you and says we need to have some form of governmental regulation in order to improve safety, you should always keep in mind it's difficult to anticipate how people will respond to such regulation. Keep in mind also that, as I said, when you try to look at one aspect of a very complicated set of interactions, you may achieve better results with respect to that isolated aspect, but at the cost of overall problems. Whenever somebody says better safe than sorry, make sure that we all know which is safe and which is sorry. And always keep in mind that the pursuit of no risk may carry very substantial consequences. And again, I like the encapsulation of this notion in the phrase, no risk is the highest risk of all. In addressing these questions, I cannot emphasize too strongly. One must recognize it may be very difficult to assess risk accurately, and thus reasonable people, people of good character, may disagree vigorously over how we deal with such risk in a free society. And I want to caution people of liberty orientation. There's a tendency on the part of people of liberty orientation to look at potential problems and say, oh yes, look at all these potential problems. Just as enthusiasts for government regulation frequently overestimate the benefits, we have to be very careful that we don't overestimate the costs. And we should always keep in mind, risk analysis is damned hard to do. It's damned hard to do properly. And whenever we go out and try to explain these ideas to people, we have to do it with a certain degree of humility, because in many cases, as I said, reasonable people of good character may disagree legitimately over the appropriate response to such risk. For those of us who are advocates of liberty, I think it's useful to keep in mind 2 additional points. One is, in a free society, the default value is freedom. The burden of proof should never be upon those who argue in favor of the free society. The burden of proof is always upon those who argue in favor of the use of governmental regulation. And governmental regulation proceeds basically, ultimately, at the point of a gun. Government is force, and those who favor the use of such force, it is their job to demonstrate the validity of their point. It is not ours. The burden of proof is not upon the liberty advocate. It's upon those who would use the coercive mechanism of the state. Also, an important point, which I don't think is emphasized enough by liberty activists, and that is governmental regulation for purposes of safety frequently, perhaps inevitably, involves discrimination. Government discriminates in favor of some at the expense of others. And in my classes at UVA, I actually give a fair number of examples. Time reasons prevent me from going into this. Perhaps at some point down the line, we'll do another webinar where I'll go into a little bit more depth in terms of actual case studies of this if SFL thinks it would be useful for me to do so. Now, finally, I want to whip through this very quickly. Some of you may have actually seen this before because I tucked this into a previous webinar. And I just like to toss this out for my students because I think it actually helps them understand an important point. let's look at the TV game show Risk. You've probably seen the show Risk. It's extremely popular, sweeping the country. People are just enthralled by this show. A contestant gets on the show. The contestant pushes a button. The button uses a randomizing process to flash either a green light or a red light. And depending upon which light flashes, the contestant will receive a prize. If the green light flashes, and it will flash with probability P, there will be $1 million reward. So you push the button, green light flashes, doggone it, I'm a millionaire. With probability 1 minus P, you push the button, a red light flashes, oh merde, horrible death. And let's assume that P is strictly between 0 and 1. So in other words, you do not have certainty of death, you do not have certainty of being a millionaire. It's somewhere in between. Now, one of the interesting features about this wonderful game show that's sweeping the country is the contestant is allowed to determine what P is. And the only rule is that P must be less than 1. In other words, you cannot have certainty of being a millionaire. There has to be some residual value. It could be very, very small, but there has to be a residual value that you'll get a red light and horrible death. Okay? So, question. Would you play the game? Now, I ask this question to my students at UVA, at least the students who are involved in classes where such questions are appropriate. And in my experience, most of them, in fact, I would even say the vast majority would say, yep, I'd be willing to play the game if I can make P very, very close to 1. And they can. All right? Well, let's change the question somewhat. Let's say that instead of $1 million, you win $1. Would you still play the game? In my experience, most students indicate they would not play the game if you swapped rewards. In other words, if the reward were $1 instead of $1 million, most students would not play the game. However, I suggest we play this game many times a day. We take all manner of risks for very low reward that do have some non-zero probability of catastrophe. We just don't think about it in these ways. And so this is why I like to show this little example. We make decisions all the time. These decisions have a potential of catastrophe. It may be a very low potential, but it's there. And we have to understand if we're going to engage in any form of regulation, and I say if because there are situations where I don't think government should be involved. To the extent that risk regulation actually deals with protecting people's rights, then perhaps there's a proper scope for such regulation. In any event, if there is going to be some type of regulation, it must be done with a sense of humility and understanding that the effort to make life safer may actually make life less safe. And so with that, what I'd like to do is to thank you for taking the time and trouble to participate in this webinar. I hope it has been helpful to you. If you have any questions, if you're interested in pursuing this further, you're welcome to drop me an email. If I can be of additional assistance, I'd be happy to do so. By the way, I've been working on trying to get a book out of this. I've wanted for many years to write a book about the issue of how do you regulate risk in a nominally free society. One of these centuries, I hope to get it done, perhaps while I'm still alive. So with that, I will ask for your questions, your comments, perhaps even your arguments. Again, thank you for taking the time and trouble to participate in the webinar, and I hope it was worth that time and trouble.
So great, thank you, Dr. Lark. So we have a couple of minutes here for questions. So if you have any, please type them into the questions box now. We have a couple on kind of a similar theme here, so I'm going to try to combine them into one for you. And that is, your argument seems to center around the fact that to calculate this risk is very, very difficult, and they have a lot of factors and a lot of variables, and it's hard to do. Well, the easy response to that, it seems, is, well, since this is really important, you know, and on big issues, then why don't you just hire a bunch of really smart people and give them some very powerful computers and let them figure it out?
That's a reasonable question. Unfortunately, even smart people have limitations. These questions are hard for smart people and for stupid people. And in many cases, the principal problem is that you're dealing with information that is not easily gatherable. It's hard to aggregate such information. You would have to go out. I mean, it's simply hard to get the information you need, even if you could do, and it's not clear what calculations you actually perform. With respect, for example, to issues of FDA regulation of medication. How do you know what information to get? Well, you can do some types of testing, but over what time horizon? It's possible that certain substances may have cumulative impacts over very long time horizons. How do you do that? Of course, the FDA and many testing regimes involve using massive doses on test animals. Well, there are many, many problems. So the question is a perfectly reasonable question. Unfortunately, it's not an issue of simply getting really smart people together and giving them lots and lots of resources. At least in most cases, that's not the issue. But let's say it were the issue. Let's say that you could get a bunch of really smart people like Jim Lark into a room, and you were able to give them lots and lots of computing technology, lots and lots of resources. The resources themselves that you use to try to answer these questions are themselves a cost. There is a cost to decisions, and it's quite possible that the cost of actually coming up with a good answer may be sufficiently great that if you just simply put those resources into other things, you might actually get better results. I'm not sure if that completely addresses the question that's being asked. It's a perfectly reasonable question. I guess my ultimate argument is there's no shortcut around the barn. It's going to be difficult for you under the best of circumstances to actually get a really good handle on whether or not something is a genuine increase in safety, at least in most of the cases in which we're really interested. There may be examples, in fact I think there are some examples, where you might be able to ascertain with some degree of confidence, is a particular technology, is a particular device, is a particular potion efficacious. It may actually make life safer. You may be able to look at certain types of regulation and say, yes, this will, we have good reason to believe it will make it safer. But my view, based on a lot of experience, is answering these questions, even under the best of circumstances, is usually very difficult.
Great, thanks. So a couple of questions here on the FDA. So first comes from Alejandro. He's wondering what should be done if a product needs to be recalled, if there's some sort of sign that a product is out on the market and it is harming people. Maybe, there's not definitive proof on this, but it looks like there might be need for a recall. Is there a role for the FDA and the government to get involved there? Well, again, very good question. If the FDA is involved at the front end, one can make the argument it ought to be involved perhaps in the back end. In other words, if FDA is allowed to have responsibility for dealing with issues of safety with respect to such products, then I think you can make a reasonable argument that if a product is required to go through the approval process, if we find side effects, if potentially serious side effects, that perhaps there's an argument for allowing them to recall. My preference, by the way, would be for a situation where perhaps people where the company, basically the purveyor of the product, decides whether or not the risk is appropriate. There are issues of situations where if you go ahead and engage in a recall, again, it's possible that substances that may help some people will now be taken off the market. So I think it's a complicated question. In many ways, it really comes down to an essential moral issue about whether the FDA should have regulatory powers in the first place. It's possible, by the way, for the FDA to be reconstituted or reformulated, where the only thing it does is simply it insists on a particular type of testing regime which all products must pass, or at least must be subjected to, and then the products can be released. Perhaps the companies that release the products have to provide some sign of what happened with respect to that testing regime, and then let customers decide which products they will take. If products are not safe, then companies usually have pretty strong incentives to recall them because they don't want to kill or hurt their customers. Unfortunately, even if you see situations where there are clear deleterious consequences, side effects of using a substance, perhaps it's because the substance has the side effects, perhaps we see a situation
where customers are improperly using the medication. They're not using it in its proper dosage. Whichever case, recalling the substances, taking them off by force, in many cases will prevent people from using a medication, from having access to a medication that they may be willing to suffer or perhaps risk the consequences because they like the benefits of the product. Again, the issue in many ways is more a moral question than a practical question. Should a government agency be able to say, no, we're going to keep this product off the market? Yes, we see the possible bad consequences. People should be informed of those bad consequences. But as I mentioned previously, you run a risk if you start saying, look, this product, if you take this tablet, it may have side effects. Perhaps this scares away people who might be benefited. Unfortunately, we have to deal with imperfect information, and I don't know that there's any easy answer to that. I don't know if the gentleman would like to ask a follow-up, because again, I'm not sure that I really answered his question. I'm not sure that anyone can really answer the question.
Great, thank you. So we have another question here, kind of on the kind of on a similar theme from Nicole, and it is, how can these concepts be applied not to the FDA and regulating the safety or effectiveness, but whether these drugs and substances, whether they actually contain what they claim to contain, I guess.
Okay, and well, it seems to me, and again, my compliments. All of the questions have been good questions. What is being suggested here is more an issue not so much of safety, but of perhaps of fraud. In other words, is a purveyor offering something claimed to be a certain product, but in reality something else? In other words, I sell what is purported to be aspirin. It turns out it happens to be rat poison or something like that. In a case like that, that's really more an issue of fraud, and I'm not sure that that's really an FDA issue. You really don't have to have an FDA, I think, in a situation like that. Although perhaps I changed the emphasis of the question somewhat, you could see a benefit of having some sort of regulatory mechanism to see whether or not what is being put into a product, maybe there are benefits to testing it on the front end to see if it actually does have what it's claimed to have. That maybe it's sort of like a product verifier rather than a safety evaluator. I can see a benefit of that, but again, it very well may come at a cost. You'll have to have the cost of the agency. Perhaps that cost could more easily be borne not by government, which is supported by taxpayers, presumably supported by taxpayers, but by the people who buy the product. Maybe there's an independent agency that does not have government imprimatur, it does not have any sort of police powers, rather like underwriters' laboratories. So if I'm understanding the question properly, I'm not sure that the FDA has to be involved in something like that. If the FDA is involved, and again, it's more a question of verifying the product as what it says it is as opposed to evaluating safety, maybe there's a role for it. My guess is that markets can handle that role at least as effectively as government, and probably at lower cost. Lower cost both in terms of out-of-pocket expenses and in terms of adverse consequences, death, and the like.
All right, great, thank you. I think we have time for one more. Questions here, there are a couple on this front. So the argument you make is a fairly complex one that takes a little bit of time to flush out. So just wondering if you have any tips or pointers on like one or two top talking points you could use when you were, say, tabling on campus or something like that, and you're in an argument with somebody.
Well, again, one of the problems, let me digress a bit. One of the problems for the liberty advocate is that the benefits of regulation, such as they are much more likely to be seen. The costs of such regulation are much less likely to be seen, just as in the case of all manner of other types of government involvement. The benefits and the beneficiaries may be much more equally seen. The beneficiaries may know who they are. They may be much fewer in number, but they know who they are. The people who bear the costs may be invisible. They may not know what cost they're bearing. For example, if a drug that might have been efficacious against some form of cancer, if it's kept off the market, it's possible that the people who were the victims of this may never know it. There's an asymmetry between the benefits and the costs, and in many cases the liberty activist in trying to explain this is in some senses always going to be at a disadvantage, because you can always point everyone who believes in say a robust governmental enforcement or regulatory regime, they can always find examples where some product got onto the market, whether it's thalidomide or some other product, tainted milk or something like that, tainted meat perhaps, and they can always point to the problems that occurred. It's hard to point to the problems that regulation caused. So to sum up, if in terms of finding sort of quick talking points, I guess the best thing to do is to come up perhaps with a little list of examples of medications, perhaps beta blockers, which were kept off the market, and to point out that there are estimates to show how many thousands of people died because certain substances were kept off the market. As a talking point, I guess I try to bring up this point about, look, in a free society, don't we want to allow individuals to have the ability to choose? Because in many cases, you're talking about life and death situations. Going back to Ms. Bacon's statement that I included in my PowerPoint slides here, government regulation is keeping a substance out of the hands of someone who wants to try it. Who the hell are you to tell me I can't ingest what I want? So to some extent, it's not the most intellectual argument. It's a bit more emotional, but perhaps the best talking point, if you want to have a 30-second talking point, is to say, look, it's my life, it's my body. I realize life's a risky business. I don't think government should have the power to tell me what I will put in my body for my health, safety, or comfort. Again, if you're an advocate for liberty, you have to understand that we face a bad asymmetry. The benefits of governmental regulation in many cases are much more easily seen than what may be massive costs, but the victims don't know who they are. You may never be able to identify them. I hope that answers your question.
All right, thank you. That's it for the evening. Dr. Lark, thank you again for joining us.
Well, again,
it's always
thanks
a pleasure
to the audience. Good questions. If people are interested in more information, if this is a topic in which they'd like to know more, they're welcome to drop me an email. And I should point out I'm buried under a very large faculty teaching load this semester. I'm the load-bearing wall for my department. But I will endeavor to respond as quickly as possible. And again, I'm flattered that people would take time out of their schedules to participate, and I hope they felt that they got something out of it. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Dr. Lark. As always, everyone, we will be posting these webinars online in the next couple of days. So if you have a friend or someone that you think should watch it, think they'd get some information out of it, feel free to direct them towards studentsforliberty.org. Next week, we will actually be changing our webinar format for the rest of the semester. We're going to be moving till Wednesdays at 8 p.m. And next week, we're going to have the infamous Brian Kaplan doing a presentation on immigration policy. So I hope you'll be able to spend some time with us next Wednesday, take an hour and listen to Brian Kaplan talk. And, of course, he'll be taking questions like all of our wonderful speakers do. That's it. Soon you're going to be receiving an email with a link about tonight's program. Please give us a little bit of feedback so we can continue to improve. These have been a great success so far, and we look forward to continuing. All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.